Judge insults Karoline Leavitt in court. Minutes later, she has him in handcuffs. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy. Judge Richard Calloway leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He had ruled over this courtroom for years, bending justice to serve the powerful. No one challenged him. No one dared, until today. At the prosecution table, Karoline Leavitt stood tall, unshaken. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and the audience leaned forward. Something about this case felt different. She had spent months preparing for this moment. Every document, every piece of evidence was ready. But before she could even finish her second sentence, "Miss Leavitt," Calloway interrupted, his tone dripping with amusement. "Let's not waste the court's time. If you have a case, get to it." Laughter rippled from the defense table. His allies felt safe, protected just like their judge. But Karoline didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her voice steady. "I'm here to expose the truth, and the truth doesn't care who it makes uncomfortable." The chuckles stopped. A hush fell over the courtroom. The jury shifted. A reporter leaned forward, sensing something was about to happen. For the first time, Calloway's smirk faltered. His grip on his desk tightened. He didn't know it yet, but in just a few minutes, his own arrogance would put him in handcuffs. Judge Calloway gripped the edge of his bench, his smirk returning as he leaned forward. The tension from Karoline's last words still hung thick in the air, but he wasn't going to let her take control of his courtroom. "Well, Miss Leavitt," he drawled, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "since you're so eager to enlighten us all with the truth, I hope you actually have something worth our time." A few chuckles rose from the defense table. The defense attorney, Mark Ellis, smirked, arms folded, completely at ease. It was obvious she knew this courtroom belonged to Calloway. Karoline didn't react. She had expected this. She had studied Judge Calloway long before stepping into this courtroom. His habit of dismissing prosecutors, humiliating them, and shutting down cases that didn't serve his interest was all part of a pattern. She turned a page in her file, remaining poised. "Your Honor, I was under the impression that this courtroom was a place where facts matter," she said, her voice unwavering. "Unless, of course, the facts make some people uncomfortable." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The spectators sat up, intrigued. The jury members exchanged glances. Judge Calloway's smirk flickered for half a second, but then he leaned back in his chair with a forced chuckle. "Oh, Miss Leavitt," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "You are certainly passionate. I'll give you that. But passion doesn't win cases, facts do. And so far, I haven't seen anything worth my time." Karoline flipped to another page in her file. She was methodical, unrushed, calm, controlled. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, glancing up, "maybe you should stop interrupting and let me present them." The tension spiked. Even the court stenographer hesitated for a brief moment before resuming typing. Judge Calloway's smirk didn't return this time. Instead, his fingers drummed lightly against the desk, a small, unconscious movement Karoline caught immediately. Interesting. It was subtle, but she recognized it. A moment of hesitation, a flicker of discomfort. She wasn't the only one who noticed. The courtroom audience, once merely watching, was now whispering softly among themselves. There was a shift in the air, a realization that something bigger might be at play. Karoline pressed forward. "Let's talk about a case from 6 months ago where you dismissed all charges against a high-profile developer, despite overwhelming evidence of fraud." Judge Calloway straightened slightly. "That case was dismissed due to lack of credible evidence." Karoline nodded slowly, turning to the jury. "That's what the public record says, but here's what wasn't in the official report." She pulled out another document and placed it on the evidence table. Judge Calloway's jaw tensed. There it was again, that flicker of nervousness. Karoline suppressed a small smile. She had him, and he didn't even realize it yet. Karoline sat at her desk. the dim glow of her office lamp casting shadows over the stacks of case files before her. The courtroom encounter with Judge Calloway still echoed in her mind. The way he had dismissed her, the flicker of discomfort in his eyesit, was a crack in his armor. And Karoline knew one thing for sure: if there was a crack, there was something to uncover. She flipped open a thick file labeled Calloway Cases. She had spent weeks compiling it, carefully going through years of his rulings. And now, as she scanned the pages again, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Every time a high-profile businessman, real estate developer, or corporate CEO stood trial, Calloway ruled in their favor. Fraud, bribery, embezzlement, corruption, case after case, the guilty walked free. Karoline's fingers tightened around the page. This wasn't coincidence, this was control. A name stood out: Franklin Moore, a billionaire developer whose fraud case had mysteriously vanished. The same case Calloway had dismissed months ago. The same case she had brought up in court today. Her pulse quickened. She needed more. She needed a link, something undeniable. That's when she remembered a contact she had been meaning to reach out to. An hour later, Karoline stepped into a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of the city. Sitting in the back booth was Liam Carter, an investigative journalist who had been following corruption cases for over a decade. Liam glanced up, a knowing smirk crossing his face. "Took you long enough, Leavitt. I was wondering when you'd come knocking." Karoline slid into the seat across from him. "You've been investigating Calloway for years. I need everything you have." Liam leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You're playing with fire. Calloway isn't just a judge, he's a gatekeeper. He decides who walks free and who goes down. And I can tell you one thing: he never lets the rich and powerful go down." Karoline already knew that much. "Do you have proof?" Liam reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a thick envelope. He slid it across the table. Karoline opened it and felt her breath hitch. Bank statements, wire transfers, offshore accounts. "Anonymous payments," Liam said, "tracing back to shell companies owned by the very people he ruled in favor of. Calloway isn't just corrupts being paid to keep criminals on the streets." Karoline's mind raced. This was exactly what she needed. But it wasn't enough. "If I take this to court, he'll dismiss it as circumstantial," she said, shaking her head. "I need something solid, something that ties him to these payments directly." Liam studied her for a moment, then smirked. "Then you're gonna need a witness." Karoline met his gaze. She already had someone in mind. Karoline sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel as she stared at the apartment building in front of her. It was old. The paint peeling from the edges, the flickering streetlight above barely illuminating the entrance. She had spent the last 2 hours tracking down Daniel Reeves, a former court clerk who had worked under Judge Calloway for 8 years. Then, without warning, he quit. And Karoline was determined to find out why. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out and made her way up the narrow staircase to apartment 3B. She knocked firmly. No answer. She knocked again. This time she heard shuffling on the other side of the door. After a long pause, the door cracked open just enough for a pair of tired eyes to peer out. Daniel Reeves looked older than his years. The dark circles under his eyes, the cautious glance over her shoulder. He was afraid. "I'm not interested," he muttered, starting to close the door. Karoline stuck her foot in the doorway. "Mr. Reeves, I know why you left, and I know you're scared." Daniel stiffened. His knuckles whitened against the door frame. "I can't help you," he whispered. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Karoline held his gaze. "Judge Calloway." His breath hitched. "I know he's corrupt," she continued, her voice firm but steady. "I know you saw things while working for him, things you couldn't live with." Daniel's eyes darted around as if the walls themselves could hear. "He's dangerous," he said, barely above a whisper. "So am I," Karoline countered. "But the difference is I'm on the right side of the law." Daniel hesitated, his grip on the door tightening. Karoline softened her tone. "I can protect you, but I need your help. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Seconds stretched. Then finally Daniel let out a shaky breath and stepped aside. "Come in," he said. Inside, the apartment was small but tidy. Daniel sat across from Karoline, rubbing his hands together as if trying to wipe away years of guilt. "I saw everything," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "The bribes, the case tampering, the threats to lawyers who got too close." Karoline leaned forward. "Start from the beginning." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. It started small. Calloway would get gifts, expensive ones, from wealthy defendants. Then the payments came, money wired to offshore accounts. Cases with solid evidence against high-profile criminals would suddenly crumble. He swallowed. And then there were the threats. Karoline narrowed her eyes. "Threats?" Daniel nodded. A defense attorney once questioned a ruling. The next day his house was broken into, but nothing was stolen, just a message left on his desk. "What did it say?" Daniel looked up. His voice was barely a whisper. "Stop asking questions." Karoline exhaled slowly. She had been right. Calloway wasn't just corrupt, there was dangerous. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small recorder, placing it between them. "Daniel, will you go on record?" His hands shook slightly, but then he nodded. "I'm done being afraid." As he began to speak, Karoline pressed record. Karoline sat at the head of the conference table in the district attorney's office, surrounded by her small but trusted team. Stacks of financial records, wire transfer reports, and legal documents covered the table. The room was silent except for the rhythmic tapping of her pen against the desk. "We're close," she finally said, her voice steady. "We just need to find the final link that directly ties Calloway to the money." Her investigator, Ethan Cole, a sharp forensic accountant, leaned forward. "We've traced multiple offshore accounts under different fake names. At first, they looked like shell corporations, but when we cross-referenced them with Calloway's rulings, we found a pattern." He slid a file across the table. Karoline flipped it open, her eyes scanning the data. "The dates of these deposits," Ethan continued, "match up perfectly with high-profile cases where Calloway ruled in favor of powerful defendants. Every time a fraud case was mysteriously dismissed, a new deposit landed in these offshore accounts, millions of dollars, transferred through a web of fake businesses." Karoline's grip tightened on the folder. This was it. Calloway wasn't just bending the law. He was selling verdicts. "We need someone inside his circle to confirm this," she said, placing the folder down. "If we go public now, he'll twist this against me, call it a political attack. He'll bury us before we even get to court." Her legal assistant, Mia Torres, nodded. "We need a witness, someone who can verify these transactions aren't just coincidences." Karoline took a slow breath. "And I think I know just the person." Later that evening, Karoline sat alone in her office, staring at her laptop screen. Calloway was powerful, but now she had something he feared. She pulled out Daniel Reeves' testimony, replaying his recorded words in her mind. The bribes, the threats, the offshore accounts. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. 1 ring, 2, 3. Finally, a voice answered. "Who is this?" Karoline leaned back, a determined look in her eyes. "Someone who knows what you did, and someone who can protect you if you tell the truth." Silence, then a quiet sigh. "Meet me tomorrow, but if you're lying, this conversation never happened." Karoline smirked. She wasn't lying. Calloway's empire was about to come crashing down. The courtroom felt different today. The air was heavier, the tension thicker. Judge Richard Calloway sat at his bench, gripping his gavel just a little too tightly. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by something far less confident. Karoline noticed immediately the way he shifted in his seat, how his jaw clenched every time she spoke. He was on edge. She had been chipping away at him for days, presenting pieces of evidence, carefully pushing his buttons, making him feel the walls closing in, and now, for the first time, he was cracking. "Miss Leavitt," Calloway snapped, his voice sharper than usual. "Get to your point. The court has no time for your drawn-out theories." Karoline simply turned a page in her folder, her posture as steady as ever. She wasn't rushed. She wasn't nervous. Your Honor, this is not a theory, she said smoothly. This is a financial trail leading directly to offshore accounts under false names. Accounts that, coincidentally, received large sums right before key rulings in your courtroom. The spectators murmured. The jury shifted. Even the defense attorney who had previously looked comfortable stole a nervous glance at Calloway. The judge slammed his gavel down. Enough! This is reckless speculation. His voice boomed across the courtroom, but there was something different about it. It wasn't authority. It was panic. As the trial continued, Calloway's frustration boiled over. When Karoline tried to submit more financial documents, he denied them without even looking. When a witness took the stand against him, he cut them off, ruling their testimony irrelevant. When the jury took notes, he glared at them, his fingers drumming anxiously on his desk. This wasn't the same man who once ruled this courtroom with an iron fist. His movements were erratic. His face was shiny with sweat. His once powerful voice now carried a slight tremor. Karoline didn't press him. She just watched. She saw the way the courtroom reacted to him, how the whispers grew, how even his most loyal allies in the gallery looked uneasy. Judge Richard Calloway was unraveling. Outside the courtroom, the ripple effect had already begun. Reporters were digging deeper into his financial ties. Powerful business figures who once stood by him were now scrambling to distance themselves. 2 CEOs who had benefited from Calloway's rulings quietly cancelled their usual courtroom visits. A high-profile attorney, once seen dining with Calloway regularly, suddenly stopped returning his calls. They sensed what was coming, and no one wanted to go down with him. Back inside the courtroom, Karoline remained strategic. She could have pushed harder. She could have exposed everything today, but she didn't. Instead, she let Calloway bury himself further, let him snap at her, let him make mistakes, let him prove to the jury that he was a man desperately trying to hold on to power. Because she knew the moment to strike wasn't now. It was coming. Very soon. And when it did, there would be no escape. The headline hit the news like a thunderclap. Corruption in the courtroom. High-profile judge linked to secret payments. Karoline sat in her office, watching the story explode across television screens and social media. It was just a small leak, a single piece of evidence carefully chosen to stir the waters. But it was enough. Within hours, reporters swarmed the courthouse. The public wanted answers. More importantly, so did Judge Calloway. Inside his chambers, Calloway paced like a trapped animal. His usual confidence was nowhere to be seen. He gripped his phone, dialing a number with unsteady hands. "What the hell is happening?" he barked the moment the line connected. On the other end, his longtime political ally, Senator Whitmore, sighed. "It's all over the news, Richard," Whitmore said. "The financial transactions, the cases you dismissed, it's out now." Calloway's grip tightened. "You need to make this go away. Get the press to focus on something else. Find dirt on Karoline. I don't care what it takes." A pause. Then Whitmore's voice came back, quieter. "You don't get it, do you?" Calloway frowned. "Get what?" "They're already pulling away. The donors, the businessmen, the other judges who once backed you, they're cutting ties. No one wants their name attached to you right now." Calloway's breath hitched. For the first time, he felt vitriol fear. "They wouldn't dare," he whispered. "They already have." Whitmore hung up. Calloway stood there, his world crashing down around him. Calloway stormed back into the courtroom, visibly agitated. His face was red, his movements sharp and erratic. Before Karoline could even say a word, he slammed his gavel down. "This court will not tolerate baseless distractions," he snapped, his voice bordering on hysteria. "Miss Leavitt, if you continue wasting this court's time, I will hold you in contempt." Karoline didn't blink. Instead, she slowly rose from her seat. "Your Honor, with all due respect," she said calmly, "I think we both know who's running out of time." The gallery erupted in murmurs. The jury watched closely. Even the court clerk hesitated before continuing to type. Calloway's face darkened. his hands clenched on the bench. He was losing control. And Karoline wasn't even finished yet. That night, he made more calls. To attorneys, to old friends in government, to business executives who had once owed him favors. "You owe me," he growled into the phone. "I protected you. I made things go away for you. Now I need you to do the same for me." But every call ended the same way. Silence, excuses, or worse, unanswered. They had abandoned him. He had spent years bending the law in favor of the rich and powerful. Now that he needed them, they were nowhere to be found. And as he sat alone in his darkened office, staring at the evidence stacked against him, he realized something chilling. Karoline already had enough to bring him down. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Karoline stood at the prosecution table, calm, focused, completely in control. Across from her, Judge Richard Calloway shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his once commanding presence now cracked and fragile. He knew something was coming, but he had no idea just how bad it was going to be. Karoline cleared her throat. "Your Honor, I would like to submit new evidence into the record." She reached into her folder and pulled out a thick stack of documents clipped neatly together. "This," she said, placing it on the evidence table, "is a financial report detailing offshore bank accounts under various shell companies." She let the words settle. The courtroom stirred instantly. Reporters leaned forward. The jury members stole quick glances at each other, but the loudest reaction was Judge Calloway's silence. His eyes flicked towards a stack of documents. His hands clenched involuntarily on the bench. Karoline continued, her tone unwavering. "These accounts," she said, flipping to the next page, "received multiple deposits, totaling millions of dollars, just days before key rulings in this courtroom. Rulings that favored powerful defendants who should have been convicted." A sharp gasp came from the back of the courtroom. A few jurors visibly stiffened. Judge Calloway forced a smirk, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This is nonsense," he said, waving a hand. "Anyone can fabricate financial records. I refuse to entertain such a baseless accusation." Karoline wasn't fazed. She let the room settle, then slowly reached into her bag and pulled out a small black device. "A recorder." "If that's the case, Your Honor," she said, her voice sharper now, "then I suppose we should let you explain this in your own words." Calloway's smirk vanished. With a single press of a button, the audio filled the courtroom. A voice, his voice. "Make sure Leavitt never sees those bank records." The courtroom exploded. Gasps, shouts, reporters scrambled to write. Jurors' eyes widened in shock. Calloway went completely still. His face, once red with anger, turned ghostly pale. Karoline let the moment stretch, letting the weight of his own words crush him. "You were saying, Your Honor?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Calloway's fingers trembled against the bench. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He knew what this meant. His power, his control over the courtroom, over the system was gone. He looked toward the defense attorney as if expecting some last-minute save, but even his own allies didn't meet his eyes. The jury stared at him, not as a judge but as a criminal. Karoline took a slow step back, folding her arms. She didn't need to say anything else, because in that moment, everyone in the room knew the truth. Judge Richard Calloway was trapped, and there was no way out. For a moment, the courtroom was frozen in shock. The audio recording still echoed in everyone's minds. "Make sure Leavitt never sees those bank records." Judge Richard Calloway sat motionless, his face pale and drenched in sweat. The weight of his own words hung in the air like a death sentence. Then he snapped. "This is an outrage," Calloway bellowed, slamming his gavel down so hard that the sound echoed like a gunshot. The jury flinched. Reporters scribbled furiously. "You think you can take me down?" he shouted, his voice laced with fury. His eyes, once filled with smug confidence, now burned with desperation. His gaze locked onto Karoline. "You're just another over-ambitious prosecutor looking for headlines." His voice cracked slightly at the end, a sign that his bravado was wearing thin. The jury wasn't buying it. The audience, which had once watched him with respect, now saw him for what he was, corrupt man unraveling under the weight of his own crimes. Reporters whispered to each other, noting every movement, every frantic word. Even the court bailiff shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the security officers near the door. Karoline, however, remained unshaken. She stood at the prosecution table, arms crossed, her expression calm. The contrast was striking, a panicked judge, red-faced and yelling, versus a prosecutor who barely looked fazed. And then she spoke. "Your Honor," Karoline said, her voice level controlled, "I suggest you compose yourself." Calloway's breath hitched. She tilted her head slightly, watching him unravel. "You're making this case easier for me." The courtroom gasped. A few reporters muttered, their pens scratching against notepads. The jury exchanged glances, some nodding ever so slightly. Because Karoline was right. Calloway was proving her case for her. Calloway gritted his teeth, realizing the trap he had walked into. He tried to recover, forcing out a bitter chuckle. "This is nothing but a setup," he muttered, straightening his robe. "A pathetic attempt to ruin a good man's career." But no one believed him. The truth was out. His empire was crumbling. And Karoline? She hadn't even presented her final move yet. Judge Richard Calloway had no idea what was coming next. Judge Richard Calloway's breathing was heavy, his fingers gripping the edge of his bench so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The courtroom was slipping out of his control, and he knew it. But he wasn't going down without a fight. "This case is over," he declared, his voice forceful but lacking the authority it once held. He slammed his gavel down, the sharp sound ringing through the tense courtroom. "I am dismissing all charges against..." Boom. The courtroom doors burst open. Gasps rippled through the crowd as 3 FBI agents strode in, their dark suits crisp, their movements precise. Behind them, 2 U.S. Marshals followed. The lead agent, a tall man with sharp eyes, stepped forward. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a warrant, and spoke in a voice that carried through every corner of the room. "Judge Richard Calloway, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, bribery, and conspiracy." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled to grab their phones, cameras flashed, and murmurs turned into a full-blown uproar. The jury sat frozen, some with their mouths slightly open, unable to believe what they were witnessing. And in the middle of it all, Calloway sat completely still. For the first time in his life, he had no words. His mind refused to accept it. This couldn't be happening. Slowly, Calloway forced out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "You can't be serious." The FBI agent didn't flinch. "Your Honor," he said, mocking the title that no longer held any power, "you have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it." A few quiet gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even the defense attorney shifted uncomfortably. Calloway's chest tightened. "You can't do this," he snapped, his voice rising. "I am the law." The lead agent stepped closer. Not anymore. The 2 U.S. Marshals moved in. Calloway jerked back violently, knocking over a glass of water. "Get your hands off me!" he roared. But it didn't matter. In a swift motion, the Marshals grabbed his arms, yanked him to his feet, and turned him around. Clink. The metallic sound of handcuffs snapping around his wrists rang through the silent courtroom. For years, Calloway had ruled this courtroom, handing down sentences with ease. Now, he stood here as a criminal, his own fate decided. Karoline watched silently from the prosecution table. She had won. Not with words, but with the truth. Reporters rushed forward, pushing microphones toward her, trying to get a statement. But Karoline simply stood there, watching as the once powerful judge was led through the courtroom, past the jury, past the very people whose lives he had manipulated. Calloway refused to look at her. Maybe because he finally understood she was the one holding the gavel now. The metal cell door clanked shut. the finality of the sound echoing off the cold concrete walls. Judge Richard Calloway, once feared, once respected now, sat alone on a hard cot, staring blankly at the floor. For years, he had controlled the fate of others. Now, his own fate was sealed. His hands trembled as he reached for the small phone mounted on the wall. He had spent his life protecting powerful people, making their problems disappear. Now, he needed them to return the favor. Ring. Ring. Straight to voicemail. Frowning, he tried another number, an old senator he had once saved from a corruption scandal. No answer. He dialed again, a corporate executive who had benefited from his rulings. Nothing. Call after call. Silence. His allies had abandoned him. He had spent his career twisting justice for the rich and powerful, but the moment he needed them, they vanished. Calloway exhaled shakily, his empire crumbling around him. He wasn't the law anymore. He was just another convicted man waiting for his sentence. And for the first time in his life, he had no way out. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, legal analysts, former colleagues, and members of the public all gathered to witness the downfall of a once powerful man. At the defense table, Richard Calloway sat motionless, his face hollow, his hands cuffed in front of him. His once commanding presence had been reduced to nothing more than a shell of the arrogant judge he once was. Karoline Leavitt stood tall as she took the witness stand. With unwavering confidence, she laid out the final, irrefutable pieces of evidence. The bank records, the offshore accounts, the whistleblower testimony, the secret recordings. There was no room for doubt. The jury was dismissed to deliberate. They returned in less than an hour. The foreman stood, clearing his throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant Richard Calloway guilty on all counts." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Some gasped, others nodded. Justice had spoken. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked at Calloway. "Richard Calloway, you are sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for bribery, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy." The once mighty judge hung his head. As he was led away in handcuffs, this time for good, Karoline watched, victorious. Justice had finally been served. The courthouse steps were swarmed with reporters, their cameras flashing. Microphones extended toward the podium where Karoline Leavitt stood, victorious. Behind her, banners from news stations read, "Disgraced judge sentenced to 25 years, justice prevails." The noise died down as Karoline adjusted the mic, meeting the eyes of the crowd. "This is a victory for justice," she began, her voice strong and unwavering. "A reminder that no one, not a businessman, not a politician, and certainly not a judge, is above the law." The crowd erupted into applause. She continued, "For too long, corruption has gone unchecked. People in power believed they could manipulate the system, silence the truth, and walk away without consequences. Today, that changed. Today, the law proved it serves the people, not the powerful." More cheers followed. Some in the audience even wiped away tears, former victims of Calloway's rulings, who never thought they'd see this day. Later that evening, as Karoline returned to her office, a letter sat waiting for her. "Dear Miss Leavitt, I watched your case. You made me believe in justice again. One day I hope to stand where you stood and fight for what's right, just like you did. Thank you." She exhaled slowly, a small smile forming. Justice wasn't about power. It was about doing what was right even when the odds were against you. And with that, Karoline turned to her next case. Because justice never sleeps. If you found this story powerful and want to see more gripping courtroom dramas where justice prevails, make sure to subscribe to your channel name. We bring you real and fictional legal battles, shocking verdicts, and stories that prove no one is above the law. Like this video if you enjoyed the story. Comment below, what did you think of Judge Calloway's downfall? Turn on notifications so you never miss an update.